Hello, welcome to the course. My name is Federica Fragapane and I'm an independent visual and information designer. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce myself and my professional path, and I'm also going to introduce the project that we are going to work on together. I collaborate as a freelancer with magazines and organizations designing data visualizations. In the last years, I worked with Google, the United Nations, Scientific American, BBC Science Focus, and I'm also co-author of 2 books, a children's book, Planet Earth, and an atlas, the Geopolitical Atlas of Water, an atlas on water-related topics. What is data visualization? Data visualization is the visual representation of information and numbers. And as a data visualization designer, my main goal is to communicate stories and topics, helping their comprehension and knowledge. An aspect I love about this field is how it can bring the hidden to light. Giving a shape to information can help in showing hidden stories and in communicating issues and topics, also raising the awareness about them. Plus, I also think that data visualization can be used not only to communicate to people, but also to give a voice to people who don't have platforms. This is why one of the projects I'm most fond of is the Stories Behind the Line. It's a visual narrative of 6 asylum seekers' journeys to arrive to Italy. I first approached data visualization in 2011 when I attended the density design course during my studies. I studied communication design at Politecnico di Milano. And density design is a research lab with a focus on the representation of data and information. During that course, I really understood how interested I was in exploring the connection between visual elements and contents. My master's degree thesis is a visual analysis of organized crime in northern Italy. Then, in 2012, I started working at Accurate. It's an information design agency based in Milan and New York, and it was a very inspiring experience. In 2015, I started to work as a freelancer because I was very curious to see how my career would have evolved, taking this direction, and here I am. In the past years, I worked on projects that have different characteristics, but a common ground on the interest I have, on the connection that a data visualization piece can create with the readers, and I am particularly interested in studying and exploring this connection. In this course, we are going to explore together how to give a shape to stories, numbers, and informations. We are going to work on a static data visualization with multiple levels of information. And I'm going to guide you through all the different phases that characterize a data visualization project. I'm also going to share with you some tips and lessons that I've learned over the years. So now that you know a little bit more about me, in the next lesson I'm going to share with you my influences. In this lesson, I'm going to share with you some of the influences that had an impact on my approach to design. This is not something apparently related to design, but I really love theater, and I have been practicing as an actress since high school. It's not something that I do as a professional, but in the past years, I've had the chance to write and direct some plays, and also to bring them on stage and events in Italy and abroad. In theater, building a flow between you and the audience is essential, and you always have to keep in mind that you're working for them. I believe that this constant focus on the audience had a meaningful impact on my design approach to the visualizations. I always have to keep in mind my audience, the readers, and thinking that I'm working for them. I also worked on the intersection between data visualization and theater. I think that these words have some common points. First of all, they convey stories, information, also emotions regarding theater. They visualize. Data visualization does it, obviously, but theater does it too. Bringing a play on a stage means visualizing the scenes and giving shape to the words through the gestures, the scenography, and the actors. And they are the result of choices. Every single element in a visualization is the result of a choice, but also the position on a stage of an actor, and the gestures and the words used are the result of choices. Keeping in mind those elements, I also experimented a little bit on the intersection between data visualization and theater. I wrote a play, and then I brought it on stage, visualizing what was happening in real time, using shapes and visual elements, to try to experiment a little bit with these two different worlds. And talking about visual elements, another influence of mine are Vincent van Gogh's paintings. I still remember the first time I've seen one of his paintings in Paris, and I simply couldn't take my eyes off it. The incredible expressivity of his lines and brush strokes, and this capacity of enrich visual elements with a strong emotional component is what inspires me the most. I think that also the visual elements from a visualization can be expressive, and I think that such expressivity can help us in communicating the stories they talk about. My first data visualization as a freelancer was a visual exploration of the letters written by Van Gogh to his brother Theodorus. And also, one of the plays in which I acted was based on his life and his letters. Finally, I know that it's a cliché, but I am strongly inspired by nature. My house is full of plants, and I love to be surrounded by natural elements, and I love the organic shapes. I think that designing organic shapes can help me enriching that engagement connection that I'm hoping to get when I work on data visualization pieces. The research of beauty is not only finalized to reach an high aesthetic value, but it's to engage the readers, to encourage them in read my pieces, and therefore in reading the contents and the stories that I'm communicating through them. In the additional resources sections, you will find other artists, books, and resources I'm inspired from. Now that you know where my inspiration comes from, let's move to the next lessons, where I'm going to talk about designing visual alphabets. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce the field of data visualization and to explain how we can use visual alphabets to communicate information and stories. Let's start from the definition of data visualization according to Oxford Languages: a chart, diagram, picture that is created as a visual representation of information. We are surrounded by data and information. I want to quote Alberto Cairo. He's a journalist and designer and the night chair in visual journalism at the School of Communication in Miami. Unstructured information means reality, the world out there in all its glorious complexity. Every phenomenon that can be perceived or measured can be described as information. Information design aims at ordering this unstructured information. Giving a structured shape to data helps in understanding the complex reality behind them. Your goal as data visualization designers is communicating stories and information, giving them a visual representations to help their comprehension and knowledge. When I think about my projects, I used to think about them as the visual equivalent of articles or stories. Designing visualizations is an act similar to the writing one for me. I'm writing with visual alphabets, and in some cases also experimenting on new visual letters. In order to define these alphabets, we are going to use visual variables, elements that our eyes can see, perceive, and differentiate to order the information. Examples of these variables are position in the space, orientation, shape, size, different thicknesses of lines, different textures, and some in multiple elements, for instance. We can work on these variables singularly, but we can also combine them, and this is something that I do pretty often. Choosing the variables to use and combining them means creating our own visual alphabets, and this is an essential step in our design process. This is datavisproject.com. It's a website that you will find in the additional resources section. It's a very helpful website because it provides a catalog of possible visual representations and graphics. Histograms, for instance, use the length of a bar or lines to show numbers. And you can also arrange the histograms radially if the data or the contents need it. This is a scatter plot. Here, the variable that we are using is the position. We have elements arranged along an horizontal and a vertical axis. And then, if we need to, we can add to the scatter plot another variable, size. And here is how we have the bubble chart. And we can use both size and position differently, in a timeline, for instance. I suggest you to explore datavidsproject.com to have an idea of the possible existing solutions. Then, what I like to do is experimenting a little bit, and this is something that we are going to do together. I extracted textual data from the annual reports of the Direzione Nazionale Antimafia. It's an Italian anti-mafia organization. And we'll also come back to this project later to talk about the role of collaboration. Focusing on the paragraphs related to the situation in northern central Italy, I extracted a set of information. All the personal names that were mentioned in the paragraphs, all the terms referring to crimes, and the proximity in the text between terms referring to crimes and personal names. I had this information for 9 cities and 11 years. For each one of all these words, I had the following data: the frequency within the document and the relevance within the paragraph. I decided to visualize this data, designing a website that would have allowed the users to explore it. The website is divided into 3 sections: people, crimes, and proximity. Color and shape always represented the type of word. For instance, red circles for the personal names, blue squares for the terms, and so on. The size always represented the frequency, and the height or distance from the center, the relevance. And this phase, the definition of a legend, is an essential step in our design process, and we are going to work on it during our practical activity. For instance, this is the legend that explains how to read the people section. Here, all the personal names were grouped into the different cities. And I'm explaining that the size of the circle always represents the frequency and that the height of the element always represents the relevance within the document. For each view, I also created and added additional layers of information, as in this case, a curved line connects the names that were appearing in multiple cities. I did the same thing for the proximity section. Here, I'm grouping all the terms that were next to each other in the paragraph. And as you can see, I'm always explaining the same rules that I had previously defined. Here, as you can see, I design a graph in which each radius represents a crime. Again, the size of the element represents the frequency, and the distance from the center represents the relevance. And these are some screenshots from the project I worked on. Being the topic particularly complex and also being this a university project, I had decided to design a website to explain it. But I can't code, and at the time I didn't have actual collaborators to work with on the project to develop it. And so I just designed the mockups of the screens, and these are the images that you are going to see. I will later show you other interactive projects that I worked on. So as you can see here, I defined and used a set of rules to organize and explain the data that I had. And as I was mentioning, this is a process that we are going to work on together. Now that I introduced to you the concept of visual variables and visual alphabets, we can move to the following lesson. I'm going to talk about the very broad field of data visualization. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the wide range of possible data visualization projects, about some misconceptions, and also about the importance of knowing the usage context of our works. Data visualization is a broad field. In the past years, I've designed reports, visualizations for magazines, websites. I also designed a children's book, and I also tried to experiment a little bit mixing data visualization and theater. Also, the range of complexity that characterizes my projects is broad, according to the needs, the readers, and the usage context. I think that a misconception about this field is thinking that data visualizations necessarily need to be read super quickly, giving fast information. I don't think this is always true. It depends on the factors that I mentioned. In the data visualization world, there is enough space both for super simple infographics and for complex visualizations that allow the readers to explore complex topics with different deepnesses of analysis. It's like comparing a Twitter thread to an essay. They can be both very valid sources of information, but their validity depends on the communicative goals, on the context, and on the type of analysis. In general, the common ground of my projects is the focus on the connection that a data visualization piece can create with the readers. I am particularly interested in studying this connection and in exploring how the visual translations I work with can help me in having an impact on it. I want to show you an example talking about the usage context. A collaboration that allows me to explore my interest for visual representations is the one I have with La Lettura. La Lettura is the cultural supplement of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. And I collaborate with La Lettura designing visualizations for visual data. It's a data visualization column. And I work on the analysis and communication of cultural, social, and environmental topics. And there are two important aspects about La Lettura that I have to mention. The first one is related to the usage context. La Lettura is a printed cultural supplement published during the weekends. I often see the photographs shared by La Lettura readers on social media, and the average ones are pictures of La Lettura next to a cup of tea or a brioche, in a context that suggests as the reading act is part of a lazy and relaxing Sunday morning. Reading La Lettura is a slow process, and knowing this aspect is a meaningful impact on my design approach to the visualizations. I like to think about them as the visual equivalent of long articles, a way to create a slow reading interest connection with the readers. The second aspect is the fact that for this project, I'm asked to visual experiment while providing meaningful and interesting contents. So the intersection of these two requests allows me to work on pieces that, of course, have an informative purpose, but that are also next to the data art field, in order to visually engage the readers. Now that you have an idea of how broad this field can be, let's move to the next lesson. Here, we are going to talk about the importance of the relationship with the readers. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about an essential point, the relationship with our readers. Let's keep in mind our main goal, communicating, from the topic selection phase to the visual representations. My usual design process is mainly composed of three phases: selection of sources, data analysis, and definition of a unique and specific visual model. And we are going to work on these three phases together. I also usually propose the topics to be visualized, and this is something that I really enjoy doing. And as data visualization designers, we are people talking to other people. And for this reason, during the research and also the design processes, I find very useful starting from a very personal point of view, trying to put myself in the potential reader's shoes, and asking myself at first, what would interest me as a reader? And then, of course, could this topic also be interesting for someone else apart from myself? And I won't ever have a sure answer, of course, but I think that this exercise can be a good way to start approaching these projects. I suggest starting from a personal point of view. If there is a topic you like, you are passionate about, you are curious about, look for data about it. Try to see if you can design a project around it. I'm going to suggest some very reliable and official sources in the next lessons. And I also practice the same exercise when I work on the aesthetics of the visualizations. I try to see and I try to work on those visual elements that have a certain impact on me, thinking about the impact they could have on the readers, with the aim to design an engaging and pleasing composition. I don't focus on the aesthetics of my pieces because I like pretty things, even if I do, but because I think that working on visually appealing aesthetics, visually appealing visualizations, can help me in creating this engaging connection that I'm trying to create with the readers, in grabbing their attention. And this for me is essential because, of course, I want them to read my pieces. And because, again, remember that communicating is our goal. Anyway, also the act of temporarily detaching from my projects while they are still in progress is a very useful one. I think that starting from ourselves can be a good way to approach these projects, but of course at a certain point we have to exit from ourselves. And this is very important because we always have to keep in mind our readers. And so at a certain point, I always send my visualizations in progress to my parents, for instance, or my friends, to ask them for feedbacks because I need to understand if my visualizations are clear enough. This asking for feedback phase is very important, and I will come back to it during our practical activity. Talking about the relationship with the readers, there is another point that I consider very important: being intellectually honest with them and declaring our starting point of view. Most of my visualizations are explorative. That means that I'm not trying to prove a specific point, but that I want to provide an overview of the situation, allowing the users to explore and understand it. But of course, I always have to make choices on the data that I'm going to visualize and select, especially when I work on static pieces, because I have to deal with physical constraints. The human intervention is inevitable, but what is important is declaring this intervention, declaring that we are making choices, and declaring and explaining what we are selecting and why, in order to be clear and honest with our readers. I think that as data visualization designers, as information designers, this is a very crucial point. I want to show another practical example, a project I designed for La Lettura. It's an analysis on population density. In this case, I used as source World Bank. I'm going to show you again this source in the next lessons. The dataset provides the information on population density for all the world's countries. And being La Lettura a printed supplement, as I was mentioning, I have to make choices because, of course, I can't visualize all the data that I usually find. Here I decided to select at first the countries with a population of more than 10 million, declaring it in the legend. And then I extracted the population data for the top 40 countries by population density. Here, I wanted to design a straightforward visual model to clearly communicate this density information. So, for each country, I designed a circle, and the number of dots within the circle represents the population data. One dot is one person. For these projects, I usually work on different layers of information to give the readers the possibility of reading the topics I'm talking about with different deepnesses of analysis. So here, my first layer of information is provided by the number of dots, so the density data. And then I added another layer of information, the area of the circle, that represents the total population by country. Then I worked on the overall look and feel, because again, I think that working on these aesthetics elements have an impact on the engaging connection that I'm trying to create designing these pieces. And finally, I added another layer of information, a set of symbols that represents different geographical areas. And this is the final piece, with the legend and explanatory text explaining not only what's happening on the page, but also the choices behind these visualizations. Combining visualization, legend, and also short text, clearly explaining what's happening, it's very important because we have to be honest and clear to our readers. So now that I talked about the importance of always keeping in mind our readers and the relationship with them, I'm going to move to the next lessons. Here I'm going to talk about the role of collaboration. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the role of collaboration and the lessons that I've learned. I've shown you my master's degree thesis before. At the time, I knew that I wanted to work on an analysis of textual data, extracting data from the annual reports of the Direzione Nazionale Antimafia. But I also knew that I needed a tool to automatically extract the information from the contents. Doing some research online, I've discovered the Italia NLP Lab from the Istituto di Linguistica Computazionale Antonio Zampolli. It's a research laboratory that works on developing resources for understanding and processing the human language. I actually didn't expect them to answer me, but they did it very quickly. And they also told me how interested they were in mixing our approaches. They were incredibly kind and helpful, and collaborating with them was a real pleasure. So my suggestion here is not to be afraid of contacting people with different knowledges and backgrounds to propose our own ideas. After my thesis, we kept in contact, and a few months later, I proposed them to work on a new project, this time a commercial one, for La Lettura. It's a visualization that I've already mentioned. It's an exploration of the letters written by Vincent van Gogh to its brother Theo. It's a project that I'm very fond of, and it was also my first project as freelancer. And as you can see, any type of information, even letters, can be transformed to a visual project, to a data visualization. And this is something that makes me love this field a lot. I collaborate as freelancer with the science magazine Scientific American, designing diagrams and data visualizations. I usually work with Jen Christiansen. She's an author, data illustrator, and senior graphic editor for Scientific American. Every time that we work together on a new project, she sends me not only the data to be visualized, but also additional materials, references, papers that can help me in my design process. Some time ago, I worked with her on a visual representation of the menstrual cycle, a project that I really love designing. And besides all the data that I needed to visualize, she also sent me a very interesting paper talking about the cultural practices that surround the menstruation topics and also mentioning the taboos that still surround this topic. Reading that paper meaningfully influenced my design approach to the project. I wanted to work on a beautiful and informative piece. And in this case, I particularly focused on the role of beauty and aesthetics in contrast with the stigma still associated to menstruations. This kind of collaboration is very inspiring, and it always brings me new perspectives and new angles from which to look at the subjects I'm going to talk about. I'm also co-author of 2 books, and in both of the projects, collaboration was the key. The first one is a children's book. Its aim is to depict our planet with the tools of infographics mixed with illustrations. I'm co-author and designer of the book that has been created with Chiara Piroddi. She's a psychologist expert in development neuropsychology. And combining our experiences was extremely interesting and helpful because I had never designed data visualization for children before, and I really needed to understand if my visuals would have been understood by such a young public. We decided together the main structure of the project, and then she focused on the research phase while I was working on the overall style and look and feel. We worked together on the data to be visualized. We wanted to select very simple and also curious ones. And then I worked on the infographics because I wanted to design both simple but also evocative elements. I spent a lot of time working on the style and the visuals in the book. And I also spent a lot of time talking with Chiara Piroddi about the contents and the accessibility of them. We were conscious that we were asking the children an effort to read this book, so we were really focused on the creation of a consistent and clear visual alphabet. We created a specific index for the visualizations, a page where the readers could have all the visual elements under their eyes. And then I designed small and clear legends for all the pages. Again, collaborating with Chiara Piroddi was not only extremely interesting, but also incredibly helpful. And it also brought me in pushing a little bit the boundaries of my approach to data visualization. The second book I'm co-author of is The Atlante Geopolitico dell'Acqua, the Geopolitical Atlas of Water. It's an atlas in which we combined infographics and cartography to talk about topics related to the water subjects, topics such as water grabbing, the human right to water, or virtual water. This project is the result of a teamwork. We are 4 authors. Emanuele Bonpan is a journalist, Marirosa Iannelli is a researcher, and they worked on the contents and the text. Riccardo Pravettoni is a cartographer, and he designed all the maps, and I designed the data visualizations, the cover, and the layout. And it was very interesting to see how we combined our different competencies to talk about the complex topics with different angles and from different perspectives. Finally, I always collaborate with developers when I work on interactive projects. I'm not a developer, I can't code, so there is no code behind my static visualizations. But when I work on interactive visualizations, there are 2 friends and colleagues of mine that I always work with. Alex Piacentini, UX UI designer and developer, and Paolo Corti, developer. I worked with Paolo Corti on a project called The Shape of Dreams. It's a project that I designed for Google. It's a visual exploration of Google searches for the interpretation of dreams. And working with him was a joy, and without him, all my fuzzy shapes and my petals wouldn't have had life. I worked with Alex Piacentini recently on a project called Key Workers. It's a project on migrants' contribution to the COVID-19 response, designed for ODI. And he also worked with me on a personal project I'm very fond of, The Stories Behind the Line, a visual narrative of 6 asylum seekers' route to arrive in Italy. Again, combining our competencies is very interesting and helpful, and it also allows me to learn new methods and new design approaches. There are some lessons on collaborating that I learned during the years, and also some mistakes to avoid. So first of all, don't be afraid to declare what are your expectations before starting a collaboration, and also what you can and what you can't do, because the interesting thing is crossing different competencies. Then, if during the collaboration you notice that something is not going very well or it's not working, don't be afraid to tell it. We are not here to offend anyone. It's completely normal to give feedback and to declare if something is not going in the direction that we are expecting to go to. For instance, one project that for me didn't go well was a project in which the other collaborator wasn't giving me actual feedbacks, wasn't giving me if things were going in the direction that they wanted to see. So don't be afraid to be honest and clear with the people you are collaborating with. Don't be afraid to share what are your expectations and your goals. It's very important to start working together on a project. I really invite you to look for collaborations with people who have different stories, backgrounds, and competencies. An aspect I love about this field is the possibility it offers in terms of possible projects to work on, possible outputs, and also possible solutions, and also the possibility of integrating competencies. And I can't be an expert of all the things that I'm going to talk about with my projects. And so this is also why collaboration is the key. Now that you are more familiar with the world of data visualization, we can move on designing our own projects. In the next lesson, we are going to talk about data, the starting point of our design process. In this lesson, we are going to explore the first phase of a data visualization project: finding a reliable source, exploring it, finding the data and the story you want to tell. I mentioned before that my usual design process is composed of 3 phases: selection of sources and topic, data analysis, and then definition of a specific visual model. We are going to work on all these 3 phases together. Let's start from the sources. I often propose the topics of my visualizations, and to do so, I constantly look for new stories and datasets. I also know a list of excellent and reliable sources to look your data from. You will find it in the Additional Resources section. For this project, I'm going to use as source our word in data, an excellent and reliable source. For our project, I'm going to propose data on CO2 emissions. I really love how data visualization allows to explore complex and also urgent issues. And this is why I decided to propose you this topic. So now let's do our research. For this project, I'm going to use as source our word in data. It's an excellent resource. Let's open it on Google Chrome. So a good way to understand the quality of our source is to check its story, what organizations it's been associated with, and especially how the source is cited and referenced and by who. So let's go to the About section of our word in data. For instance, here I want to go to the Audience and Coverage section to check how this source has been used. And you see that looking at the coverage section, we can see that this source has been used by New York Times, the Financial Times, by academic papers, books, videos, and conferences. So I'm more than comfortable with this source. And now what I'm going to do is to explore the website and the topics. What I love about this website is the possibility of navigating the datasets by topic. You see that there are many options. I'm going to choose one now, but what I suggest is to start from your inclinations. Working on subjects we are interested in is a great way to start approaching this field. For instance, I'm passionate about using data visualization to explore urgent and current topics, and this is why I want to go to the Energy and Environment section. And you see that there are many possible subjects to talk about, and I'm interested into exploring the CO2 emissions section. Now we have a list of graphics, datasets about this topic. And what is interesting about our wording data is the fact that these graphics are also contextualized and commented. Now scrolling down, we see that there are many topics. And now I'm looking at this, changing per capita CO2 emissions. And I am particularly interested into exploring this subject, the per capita CO2 emissions. You see that there are many ways to find topics within this source. One of them is by subjects, but I can also type certain keywords I'm interested in looking for. In this case, I want to use the search bar, and I'm going to type per capita CO2 emissions. Here we are, and you can see that here we can find all the pages that are dealing with this subject. And scrolling down, I find what I'm looking for. As you can see, our wording data presents the data in different ways. First of all, plotted on a map, and it's already a great way to start exploring the contents. Then you can also explore them on a chart, for instance, as in this case, to see the changes over time. Here is a table so that you can see the complete dataset. And then what we want to do is to download the dataset so as to be able to work on it. And I want to download it as CSV file. I'm going to explain you later what this CSV means. So I'm clicking on it. And you can see that I've downloaded the dataset as a table. So coming back to our source, I already know that the per capita data will be my main level of information, the main story that I want to visualize. But I also already know that my visualization will be characterized by different layers of information because I want to talk about the CO2 emissions topic with different deepnesses of analysis. So I'm interested into the per capita CO2 emissions data, but I also want to explore the total annual CO2 emissions data. And so I'm going to type it in the search bar. And you see that again, we can find all the pages that deal with the subject. This is the dataset that I want to explore, the annual CO2 emissions. And you can see that again, they are plotted on a map, also visualized on a timeline, on a table. And then again, what we want to do is to download this table too. And so here we are, we have downloaded our first datasets. Now we have our datasets. In the next lesson, we are going to work on them together using Google Sheets. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to work on our data using Google Sheets. Okay, so I've opened Google Sheets. I really love it because it's perfect to work on datasets, it's online, and it's free. I created a new file, and I want to renominate it. And now what I can do is to import my dataset. I go to File, Import, Upload. I want to start uploading my main dataset, the emissions per capita. So as I was mentioning, this is a CSV file. It means that the file is a text file that uses a comma to separate values. And you see that Google Sheets already detect automatically my separator type. Here, I don't want to create a new spreadsheet, but I want to import the dataset in the existing one. So I click here and I import the data. Okay. You see that it's already divided into the different columns. So the next step is cleaning up the dataset. And I prefer to create a new tab with the cleanup version. I always prefer to save new tabs so that if I need to come back to the original dataset, I can do it. I'm going to duplicate this one and I'm going to change its name. CO2 emissions per capita, cleaned. So, as you can see, this dataset is already pretty clean, but this is not always the case. In the additional resources section, you will find a very helpful article with some tips and recommendations. For instance, a very good advice is not to have extra rows above our data. We just need the title of the column and the data below it, as it's in this case. We also want to delete the columns we don't need. In this case, for instance, I don't need this column, the code one, and I'm going to delete it. I also want to have very clear titles, so I want to change entity into country and to put the titles in bold. Now, another thing that I can do is to freeze the first row. I go to View, Freeze, First Row. And it's very useful to explore the data, keeping the title fixed here. So now I want to show a tool on Google Sheets that I use a lot, and it's a very helpful one, the Filter tool. So I select my row, and I click on Create a Filter. The Filter tool is great because it allows me to sort the data, to filter them, to organize them, and to understand what are the interesting stories to be told within the dataset. Let's see how it works. First of all, you can use it to sort the data. So you see that now next to the title there is this small arrow. I click on it and I can sort the data. This means that I'm sorting them in ascending order. And you see that it sorted all the table in ascending order. This can be very helpful to start selecting the data. Then another way in which I use the filters is to understand how many variables do I have. For instance, if I click next to here I can quickly see what are my years. And for instance, if I just want to see the data for 1 year, I click on Clear, and in this way I'm deselecting all of them. I click on the year that I want to select, let's say the most recent one, and I go to OK. And you see that now I'm only visualizing the data for 2019. So this is very helpful to start selecting the data to be visualized. This is going to be an explorative visualization. This means that I don't want to prove a specific point, but more provide an overview of the situation, allowing the readers to explore it. But as I was saying in the previous lessons, it's impossible to visualize all the data that we have, especially because we are working on a static visualizations. And so we have to find a first criteria of selection. In this case, I'm interested in exploring what are the countries with the highest per capita emissions in the most recent year. So this will be my first selection. I already selected the most recent year, and what I want to do is to sort the countries in descending order. You see? These are the countries with the highest levels of per capita emissions. Within these countries, I want to have another criteria of selection. I want to select the ones with a population of more than 5 million. And of course, later I'm going to declare this selection in the explanatory text and in the legend. And in order to find this population data, I'm going to use another excellent source. It's a source that I use pretty often, and it's called World Bank. And this is the World Bank websites. Also, this source is great because it allows you to browse the dataset by country or by indicator. We want to browse them by indicator, and we want to look for the population data. So I'm going to look for population here. Here we are, population total. And you see also this source allows you to explore the data plotted on a chart and on a map. But again, also in this case, we are interested into the actual numbers. So here we are. In this case, I don't need to download the dataset. I will simply look for the population data here because you see that it's already organized by the most recent year, and I will copy and paste it into my Google Sheet table. Okay, so as you can see now I splitted my screen in 2 parts because in this way it's easier for me to look at both my datasets. Now I want to do 2 things. First of all, I want to check the population data for the countries on my Google Sheet to see which are the ones with a population of more than 5 million people. But I also want to add the population data for the ones that are part of my selection. This is because I will later need this contextual information. So, the first thing that I want to do is to create here a new column, population. I also want this column to be included within my filters, so I'm deselecting and reselecting the filters. And I am redoing my selection of the most recent year. And you see, I just want to check they already ordered in descending order by per capita emissions. Okay, now I just want to look the countries that are in this selection here on World Bank. And I'm going to do it just pressing Command F. But first, remember that here the data are expressed in thousands. So let's start looking for Qatar. You see that the population is lower than 5 million, so I'm not going to use this country. Let's move to the next one. Okay. Let's move to Kuwait. I will keep on typing the countries to see which one of them can be my selection. Okay, so United Arab Emirates is in my selection. And what I want to do is simply copy and paste the data here. Just please only make sure that the row is the right one. And I'm going to look for my countries here and to copy and paste the data that I'm going to use. I decided to select the top 20 countries per capita emissions among the ones with a population of more than 5 million. So I'm going to fill up this population data for 20 countries. 20 countries is a good number to visualize, but if you prefer to work with 10 countries, please feel free to do it. It's already a good number to start from. In this case, I'm building up my dataset manually. It's something that I do also pretty often. Sometimes I can't find all the data that I'd like to visualize within the same source. And so combining different datasets also manually can be a good way to start working on this kind of projects. You see that in my dataset, also the continents are included. I'm not interested in showing them, so I will then remove them from my selection. Okay, I'm counting my countries. And I can see that I finally selected 20 of them. And these are the countries that I'm going to work with. Now that we've added the population data, I want to use it to actually select just the countries that I've decided to visualize. So at first, I want to select and color the countries that are part of my selection. Okay, now that I've colored the rows, let's zoom out a little bit more. Okay, I want to see them all under the same view. And what I want to do is to use the country column filters. I unselect them all, and I'm just going to look for the ones that are part of my selection. You see, I'm tapping the names and checking them. I click OK, and you see, these are the 20 countries that we are going to explore. Now, keeping selected my 20 countries, I select again all my years. I order them by year and by country. And in this way, I can have an overview of all my selected countries and all the years that we have for each one of them. Again, I cannot visualize all of these years. There are too many data and they can't fit in a static visualizations. So what I want to do is also decide which years to visualize. I'm going to filter the years and clear them. I'm interested in showing the changes over time in the last 20 years. I'm starting from 2000 and I'm selecting my years. You see, this is my first selection. So what I want to do is to copy this table and again to create a new tab with a 100% zoom. And you see, this is the starting point for our dataset. We have 20 countries. For each one of them, we have 20 years of per capita CO2 emissions. And for the most recent year, we also have the population data. let's put this in bold, and let's freeze the first row in this tab 2. Now, I think that it could be interesting to add, first of all, the total annual CO2 emission data. Remember, the second data set that I had downloaded. And then I also would like to have another contextual information by country, the GDP. It's always interesting to show countries and to display them, also visualizing some contextual information on them. So I already have the annual CO2 emissions. I'm going to add these additional columns. Let's start from the GDP. You see that I'm using again World Bank as source to extract this information. I'm using their search bar. I type GDP. Here we are. This is the data that we are going to use. You see that again World Bank provides you a chart with information on the GDP, but what we want to do is the same thing that we did for the population data. So we want to look for the data of our countries and to copy and paste the numbers. I'm going to add here the GDP column, putting it in bold. And again, as for the population, I only want the GDP for the most recent year, 2019. As I was mentioning before, I'm interested in showing the changes over time for the per capita emissions, but for the other contextual data and information, I'm fine with just showing the most recent value, 2019. So you see that here in the GDP table, the data are already shown for 2019, so everything is perfect. And I'm going to start looking for the data. Let's start from Australia, and I'm going to repeat the process country by country. So as I was mentioning before, we can find complete data sets online, and that it's perfect so that we don't have to create them manually. But I like to show contextual information, additional layer of information, additional data. And in this case, it's common that I have to create them manually, as we are doing together now. Being 20 countries, so definitely a manageable number, I can do it, just copy and paste it. It's not too time consuming. And anyway, for this kind of field, patience is a very necessary tool anyway. I'm going to show it to you also when we are going to use Illustrator. One note, you see that now I'm copying and pasting the Turkmenistan data, and we only have this data for 2018. It's not a problem. What I suggest to do is just to note down this specific comment, because then we are going to clarify this aspect in the legend. Okay, here we are. Now, another thing that I want to add to the title is the here, and we note down the only exception for Turkmenistan. Also here, I want to note the here, and also the unit of measures. You remember that in the population case, it was thousands. And in the GDP case, is US dollars. It's important to write all these annotations because then we are going to use them in our legend. Now, the last thing that I want to do is to add our last data, so the total annual emissions per country. In order to add this last data, I want to create a new spreadsheet. This is helpful because, again, I want to have my screen split in two parts so that I can easily copy and paste the information. And I want to import the dataset, because remember that we have downloaded it, as I did for the per capita one. Here we are. This is our dataset. I import it as I did before. I want to insert it here. You see again, it's a CSV file, and Google Spreadsheet is going to automatically detect the commas. I import, and here we are. So what I want to do is to filter the data, because I only want the 2019 information for the countries that are part of my selection. So let's use the filter again. I can go to Data, create a filter. Here we are. I'm just going to select the here that I want. In this case, I'm not interested in cleaning up this dataset as I did for my main one, because I just need this dataset to copy and paste information. But in general, the rules for cleaning the datasets are always the same. Okay, and now I just look for my countries. I create the column, annual CO2 emissions. Again, remember to add the here, put it in bold, and let's start copying and pasting.
Okay, and we finally have completed our dataset. I want to use filters again. Let's recap our data. I've selected 20 countries, but feel free to just select 10 if you are more comfortable with this number. For each one of these countries, I've selected 20 years of per capita CO2 emissions, but again, also in this case, 10 can be a good number of years if you prefer to start with a lower number. For each one of these years, I have the per capita CO2 emissions data, and then for 2019, I also have the population, the GDP, and the annual CO2 emissions. So this is our main information, and these are the other contextual data that we are going to represent. I'm going to use population and GDP to frame the countries, to plot them in the space. And then I'm going to add for each one of them the annual CO2 emission data and the 20 years or per capita emissions.
Now we have created our dataset. In the next lesson, we are going to start sketching, to do that shift from a table to something visual. Shifting from a table to a visual representation is essential, but can be tricky. In this lesson, I'm going to show you the method that I use. Something that for me is very helpful is to write down my variables. It's a way to recap the information and to start abstract the overall structure. So let's look at our dataset. I have 20 countries, but you can also have 10. And for each country, we have the following data. Emissions per capita, total emissions, population and GDP. Now I can start thinking about a possible visual representation and about the possible visual variables that I can use. GDP and population are contextual information. I want to use them to position the country on the page, and I'm going to use as visual variable the position one. I can use a scatter plot to do it. The horizontal axis can be population, and the vertical one can be GDP. Each dot is a country. My main data are the per capita emissions over time, so I will need a visual representation able to show a timeline. Being this my central information, I want to use an interesting shape to visualize it. And I'm going to look for visual inspiration, especially for this data. We are going to work on it together in the next lesson. Finally, I want to add the total annual emissions data. I want to represent this information as different sized circles. So, as you have seen in this phase, I've started sketching the visual variables that I'm going to use, and I've started to define my visual language for this visualization. This is the rules that I define, but feel free to select your own visual variables and to define your own visual alphabet. So I'm using GDP and population to contextualize all my countries. And then for the main information, the one on per capita emissions and total emissions, I'm going to use the variable size and also a new variable that I'm going to create after having looked for visual inspiration. I want my main message to be on the CO2 emissions, but I think it's also interesting sometimes to provide contextual information and additional layers of information on the countries that we are going to explore. Now that we have a first idea of the overall structure, we can move to a phase I love, the visual inspiration one. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how I look for visual inspiration, especially from words that are not related to data visualization. This can help us in designing our own visual alphabet and also in finding your own visual style. The inspiration phase is very important to me. I constantly look for visual inspiration, not only when I have to start a new project, but basically every day. I really love to pay attention to the visual elements and to understand which shapes and textures my eyes are attracted to, because then I like to work on them, thinking about the impact they could have on the readers. I usually work on this phase after having studied the data. Already having in mind the structure of my contents helped me in finding those elements I can work on and that can be helpful for my visualization. I use Pinterest a lot. I have tons of images grouped in different boards. Let me show you.
This is my Pinterest profile. You see that I have tons of images grouped in different boards. This, for instance, is the board visual, where I collect images my eyes are attracted to. There aren't a lot of purely data visualization works in my boards. Of course, I want to stay updated on what other colleagues of mine do, but I also love to take inspiration from images that are not part of the data viz world. This is what helped me in finding my style, whose research was a pretty instinctual process. During the years, I learned to understand what are the elements my eyes find appealing and how I can find them and then replicate them. And this process is constantly in progress. In this case, thinking about our data, I know that I need a shape able to convey a temporal information, and I have to replicate it for 20 countries on a scatter plot. So I want to think of a small multiples option. Just to show you some examples, these are small multiples. Many small graphs clustered together in a single visualization. It's a good way to display different variables of a dataset, condensing them and comparing them. So I think that as structure, this is the one that I'm going to use. But I want to use organic and expressive shapes and elements. So having in mind that this kind of representation is helpful to me, I want to look for visual inspiration starting from it. These are the images that I collected. I want to show you why I selected them and what I can use from these sources of inspiration. For instance, I selected this image because of the structure. I could use different lines arranged on a semi-radial shape to show the different ears. Then, having in mind this part of this source of inspiration as main structure, I've also selected these other images because I really like the shapes, the organic look and feel, and the curves. I would like to replicate something similar. You see, also in this case, I really love these organic and soft curves. I really love to work on organic shapes. I think they can help me in creating an engaging connection with the readers. The same concept is valid for this image. And I also like these images a lot, these corals illustrations. They look like small multiples to me. They are not, but the structure could be similar, you see? And I also really love the color. I think I'm going to use similar colors for my graphics. The same is for this image. I like it because I think it's beautiful but also slightly creepy, and thinking about our topic, I don't mind using it as inspiration. Now I have in mind a clearer idea of what I can do with my visual alphabets and how I can define my set of rules.
Okay, now that I found the images my eyes are attracted to and that I found visual inspiration, I can go back to sketching. You know that I analyzed 20 years for each country, and again, maybe you just decided to analyze 10 years and it's fine. So that means that I will have 20 lines for each country. Each country can be a group of different curved lines. Each line is a year. And the length of the lines represents the per capita emissions data. Then something that we are going to do is to test our ideas on Illustrator. This is something very common. Maybe sometimes I have an idea, but then if I test the actual data on Illustrator, I have to change it. It's perfectly fine, and it's important not to be too fond of our first ideas and being able to change our mind. So let's draw again our structure. On the horizontal axis, we are going to use the population data and the GDP for the vertical axis. We are going to arrange the countries along this axis. I decided to use the different curved lines to show our main data, the per capita emissions. And finally, we are going to add our last level of information, the total annual emissions, that I'm going to represent with a sized circle. You see, these sketches are very ugly, but they help me a lot in understanding which elements I have and what I can do with the visual variables. So the next step will be actually drawing them using a set of tools. At first, I'll work on the main structure, the scatter plot. And in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to do it using an excellent free online tool, raw graphs. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use raw graphs. It's an excellent free online tool to design data visualizations, and I use it pretty often for the main structure of my projects.
This is raw graph. You will find the link in the additional resources section. It's great because it's online, it's free, and it's an excellent tool to create visualizations. What is great from raw graphs is the fact that you can simply copy and paste your data here in this box. You can also use their samples if you want to start exploring it. So, in my case, I want to use raw graphs for the overall structure of my visualization. I know that I will create a custom visualization on Illustrator for this part. So for now, I'm just selecting 2019 as here because it's the year I'm going to use raw graph for. This is the dataset that I want to copy and paste. Command A to select all, Command C to copy it, and I paste it here. And you can see how it's already perfectly organized. Now, scrolling down, you can see that in this section, you can select the visual model that you want to use. There are many excellent options, and again, you can explore it using their samples to try different representations. In our case, we want to use the bubble chart. And this is the section that allows us to create the graphic. Here I can see all the titles of my columns. This is also why it's important that each one of our columns has a clear and correct title, because then we are going to use it on raw graphs. And then here we have the chart variables. What we can do is drag our columns into the chart variables. So for instance, in this case, I want the population to be my x-axis, the GDP to be my vertical axis, and I want the country to be the label, of course, so that I can see which country is each circle. Now, in this case, you see that the graph is pretty unreadable because of the gap in the data between the United States and the other countries. Now, I have a few options. I could cut the axis and clearly explain that there is a gap there. But I'm not a fan of this solution, and in this case, these two contextual data aren't the main information I want to convey. I just want them to plot the countries on the space. So in order to have a cleaner layout, I will order the countries according to population and GDP. So I won't visualize the actual number, but only the order. In order to do that, I go back to my sheet and I want to create a new one, just for raw graph, a new tab. Duplicate, and I call it for raw graphs. Now, I want to create two more columns, population order and GDP order. First, let's remove filters. Here we are, population order and GDP order. I recreate the filter, and then at first, I reselect the year that I want to be selected, 2019, and then I order them. At first, according to population. You see that the countries are now ordered, and I just want to write down numbers from 1 to 20. It's a trick that will help me in quickly visualizing the order on row graph. And I want to do the same thing with the GDP. I sort them in ascending order. I type the numbers from 1 to 20. And here we are. Now, I reselect all my table, Command A, select all, Command C to copy it. I go back to row graphs. I reset my data because now I want to pass the new table. Here we are. I reselect the bubble chart. And now I'm going to drag my columns again. So I want this time the population order to be my horizontal axis, GDP order to be my y-axis. And you see that now the countries are way more organized and the visualization is cleaner and more readable. Now I want the country to be my level, you see? So this is why I use the numbers from 1 to 20. It's just a way to have the countries correctly ordered along the axis. But then, of course, in my Illustrator file, I'm going to delete these numbers because I don't need them. But what I want to do then will be to add here the actual population and GDP numbers, because I'm not visualizing them, but I want to show the correct numerical information anyway. So now there is one last thing that I want to do with row graph, and it's to add the annual CO2 emissions data as size. You see that now the circles have been resized. Now I can change here the parameters so that it's visible enough. You see here in this section I can customize my graphic and I want to increase the max radius of the circles. You see that now it's more readable. And I also want to change the size of the artboard. Let's put this size. And I also want to click on Show Legend. Now it's not included here, but once I will export the file and to work on Illustrator, I will be able to see also the legend. Finally, I can export the graphic as a SVG file. Emissions structure. You see, I could also export it as PNG or JPEG, for instance, but saving it as SVG is great because I will then be able to work on it with Illustrator. I download it and here we are.
Okay, now that we have the main structure, let's open it and edit it with Illustrator. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to do it. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use Adobe Illustrator to edit our graphic and also to add more layers of information to it. Let's do it.
This is our Illustrator file. You're going to find this file, the template, in the attachments section. You see that I've already created 3 layers. You will find them in the file. The background layer, but now I want to block it because I don't need it. The visualization layer, where we are going to put our graphic design with row, and then this will be for the legend and explanatory text. So the first thing that I want to do is importing our SVG file. And I want it to be here on my visualization layer. Okay, so now as you can see, this is a completely vectorial file. So you have to ungroup it a few times, going on Object, Ungroup. And you can edit everything. You can edit the shapes, the colors, the fonts. You see that here you can now see the legend, headlines. We are going to add a grid, but this is not something we want to work on now. I'll work on these aspects later. Now I want to use Illustrator to visualize our main level of information, the per capita CO2 emissions. Remember, we have 20 years for each one of these countries. So let's come back to Pinterest. I want to copy the images that I found so that I have them here as reference. Let's say also this one. Okay, I decided that each year will be represented by a curved line, and I want to design this curved line. So let's start designing one using the pencil tool. I will design a few options. And then if you are not satisfied with them, something that I do is go into Object, Path, Simplify, and you see that you can simplify your shape. I'm satisfied with this shape. Now this curve will be 1 year. I want to show you how we'll use the single curve to have our 20 years for country. I'm selecting it, I'm pressing R on my keyboard, or if you prefer this, rotate tool, and I'm clicking here. I want this to be my anchor point. Then I'm pressing Option so that I can duplicate it, and I'm just dragging it, you see? Now, what I'm going to do is to go to Object, Transform again, or Command D, and you see, it just repeated my previous action. And I'm going to do it for 20 lines. You see, this is a very great way to super quickly have our shape. Now, each line is 1 year, and this is my whole country. What I want to do is to resize them, my lines, according to the correct numbers, so the per capita CO2 emissions. And of course, I won't do it manually. I want to do it using an accurate representation of my numbers. And in order to do it, I'm going to use some tools that Illustrator provides. For instance, also with Illustrator, it's possible to design graphics. You see here, for instance, I have a bar chart. It's not the one that I'm going to use, but I want to show you. I click here, I create my shape. And also here, you can or copy and paste your numbers or just type in them. I just want to show you an example. You type your numbers here, you press check, you see, and you have your graphic. And at the moment, this is not a normal vectorial file, because if you click and go to data, you can then change your data or add numbers, and you see that it changes also the graphic. If you want it to be a normal vectorial element, you ungroup it. You go to Object, Ungroup. It will ask if you really want to ungroup it, because once you have ungrouped it, you cannot change the data anymore. I go to Yes, and group it a few more times. And you see, now I can work on it as a normal vectorial file. So this is just to show you that this tool exists, but I'm going to use another one. Here you see these 3 dots. Here you can find other tools from Illustrator that are not in the standard view. And I want to use the Radar Graph tool. I'm going to drag it here so that I can use it. And I want to quickly show you how it works. I type some random numbers. And you see that it displays them as a radar graph. Now what I want to do is to use this structure as base to calculate the correct length of my curves, copy and pasting my actual data. And now I'm going to show you how. If we click 2 times here on the Radar Graph tool and we go on value axis, you see that there is the possibility of selecting your minimum and your maximum value. And they reflect here. You see the minimum value is 0 and the maximum value here is 80. And this is very important because we are going to copy and paste here different values, but we want the minimum and the maximum always to be the same, so that the grid is always the same and also the reference points. So I want to see what are the minimum and the maximum values of the data that we are going to copy here. Let's go back to our dataset. I want to duplicate again this sheet and to call it for Illustrator. I always like to have different steps of my dataset so that if I need to, I come back to the previous one. So now I want to select all my years. Okay. And I want to see what are the maximum and minimum value for the per capita CO2 emissions. So I'm sorting them. Okay, you see the minimum is 7 and the maximum is 35. So I'm coming back to my graph and I want to leave 0 as my minimum and a simplified version of my maximum. 40 is perfect. I can delete this example now and let's try one. I want to order my data by year now and then by country. You see that now I have all my countries, and within all my countries I have the data ordered by year from 2000 to 2019. This is the order that I want. Let's try to visualize this data. I select them, pressing Shift, Command C to copy them. I go back to Illustrator, I draw my graph. I just press Command V to paste them. And you see that I've already visualized my values, and I click here. My minimum and maximum values are the ones that I want. You see that now all these values are on a circle, but I want them to be on a semicircle. Also because it's easier this way to see the comparison among the different years. And so I want to do another quick trick. It's something that I often do. I want to add empty values here. You see, so that my data are going to be on a semi-radial shape. For instance, I want to type 15 zeros. I click check, and you see that now the data are not on a circle anymore. This is the shape that I'm going to use as reference to properly resize all my lines. I'm going to drag my shape here to adjust it, and then using this as base to resize each one of them. But we'll do this process later. At first, I want to visualize the data for all my countries. And I usually do these things outside my artboard. I can create a new layer for them. And I can call it in progress. Again, I prefer to have all the different steps so that if I need, I can come back to the previous steps if there are changes needed, and I can easily change them without having to redo everything. So we already done Australia, but let's redo it. Don't worry about the actual size because we can edit it later. So I'm copying it, pasting it here, and adding my zeros. And I also want to copy the name of my country, so I have the reference. Now, pressing Option, I drag it, duplicating it, and pressing Command D, I can do it 20 times. Command D is the Object Transform Again option that I showed you before. Now let's do the other one. I copy the data. I click on data, and if I simply do Command B, you see, it changes my data, keeping always the same grid and also these empty values that I need to create my shape. I'm going to type the number, I'm going to type the name, and I'm going to repeat the process for all of my countries. Now that I repeated the operation for all my countries, I want to use this base to draw my shape. So this is the curve that I designed. I want to recreate my shape more accurately using this reference. Let's use lighter, thinner stroke. Okay, and then I want to create my shape again using the method that I showed you before. Object, transform again. I repeat it, and you see that I'm going to refine it now, so that each line is precisely aligned to my grid. Okay, I grouped my shape, and these are the lines that I'm going to resize according to this grid. But before doing it, I want to do one last thing. I want to select the lines corresponding to the years 2005, 2010, and 2015. And I assign to them a thicker stroke. Let's use 1.2. This will be a first guide to help the readers in better looking at the years and in better recognizing the years. Then I can change the details later, but it's already useful having this first reference. I'm going to drag my shape here so that I can use it for all of my countries. And I'm going to resize it curve by curve. I told you before, patience is another of the tools needed to do this job, especially if you want to work on custom visualizations, as I usually do. So usually, these are the moments in which I listen to music or to audiobooks. I particularly love listening to Agatha Christie's audiobooks. They relax me a lot. So if there is a podcast you would like to listen, some music you love, an audiobook you would like to listen, this is a good time to do it. You see that I'm using these squares as reference because of course I'm working on custom visualizations and I'm using organic shapes. But I want my organic shapes to be accurate too. This is something that is very important. We did the first one. Let's move to the second one. And always remember to have the original shape here so that you can reuse it. If you see that it's a little bit complex to edit them because the shape is too small, you can start from the last one, as I'm doing now. I'm pressing Shift to correctly resize the curves. Another thing, if you think this graph is too dense and you want to better see it, you can ungroup it and change the stroke. You see, now it's easier. And maybe we don't need these squares. You see, as reference, we can use this. It's better. It's more precise. Okay, I'm repeating my process for Belgium too. Also for Belgium, I prefer to start from the last year. You see, the zoom I'm working on is perfectly normal. But then I will tell you later how it's important to work both on a 1000% zoom or more to have elements that are carefully designed, but also at a 50% zoom to have also an idea of the overall situation. I will talk about this concept later. I want to give you a few more suggestions in case your eyes are struggling a little bit to resize these super detailed elements. First of all, as we did before, we can just remove these squares because we don't need it in our case. So as I did before, I ungroup the chart so that I can edit as a normal pictorial file and I delete the squares. Now, as I did before, I can change the thickness of the lines so that I can better see the points. But then, you know, what I really need is this element. This one, this is the element that is going to give me the correct size. So I want to keep a thicker stroke for this element. I select the grid and the grid can be lighter. This can be thicker. You see, now it's even easier to edit the shapes. These are just quick tips to help you in using hierarchies. In this case, not only to display information for the readers, but for your own eyes. And you see how important it is to work on the different thickness of lines to help our eyes in looking at the information. We will work on similar aspects later, not for us, but for the readers. But this is already a good example to show how important these small refinements can be. Now, as you can see, I've resized all of my countries. You see that there are countries that have very interesting shapes, as these ones, that clearly show a trend. There are countries that have less noticeable differences, but what we are going to work later is designing visual clues and guides to help the readers in looking at insights, in extracting insights also from these shapes. We are going to work on these aspects later. But now let's come back to our scatter plot because we want to refine it. First of all, let's move this legend here. Let's place it a little bit better on the space and we can also increase the size a little bit more. I want to leave this space empty because this is the space where I'm going to insert the title, the legend and the explanatory text. So I know that I want this space to be free. I can increase a little bit more the size. I will also want to better use the space that I have, so to enlarge the graph, but I want to do this thing later. What I want to do now is to start creating a grid. You know, I don't need these numbers because these were numbers that I've just added to add the correct order for my countries, but I want to have anyway visual clues that allows the readers to see how the countries are ordered along the different axes. So I'm going to create a new layer and to call it grid. And I want to create vertical and horizontal lines for each one of my countries. I want them to have a dashed line. Let's use these values for now, then we can change it. I want the grid to be visible on top of the circles. So I want the line to end where the country ends. So I don't want to have a long line that arrives at the end of the scatter plot because I want to avoid unnecessary visual noise. But I will keep it long for now because it's more helpful to assign a line to each one of my countries, and then I will resize it. So let's start creating my grid for all of my countries. I'm using the Command D option again, and it doesn't matter if you see that they are not correctly aligned. We are going to do it in another way. To align them, I want the first line of my grid to be aligned to the first circle, the last one to be aligned to my last circle. Then I'm going to select all of them. Let's remove this, we don't need it. And I'm going to horizontal distribute center. You see, now they're perfectly aligned. I'm going to do the same thing for the horizontal lines. Again, don't worry if you see that they are not perfectly aligned. We are going to use the same method. And selecting them. And this time I'm going to click here, vertical distribute center. And now, as I was mentioning before, I just want my line to perfectly end here. To end here. You know, I want it to arrive to the center of the circle. I don't want unnecessary lines that just create visual noise. I'm going to do it for all of my circles. Let's do the same thing for the horizontal lines. Okay, great. And now this grid is also helpful for us because we are going to use these reference points to place our shapes. Let's select them. Let's do one thing. I go to select, same, stroke color. Here we are. And select this test. I don't want them. I'm going to create a new layer. Let's call it Fair Capita Emissions. It's better for me to have my different visual representations, my different visual informative layers in different layers on Illustrator. I want to keep these shapes here. I always prefer to have my different steps, so I'm just going to Command F, Command V. Okay, that's block in progress. We don't need it anymore. And I want to have a layer with just my correct shapes. I'm keeping them aligned so that I know which country they are referring to. I also want to change the color. I want to start using a darker color. Then we are going to refine it. To quickly change the colors, I'm going to use the super helpful tool, the Recolor Artwork. If I select the elements that have the colors that I want to use, then I click here, I click on Advanced option, and I want my pink elements to have this reddish color, so I'm just going to drag my color here, and here we are. Okay, so now we can start dragging our shapes, but before that, I want to separate the countries a little bit more. Now they're a little too close, so let's try this way. I want this to end here. I select all my vertical lines, and I'm going to reuse again this tool, Horizontal Distribute Center. I'm going to do it for the grid, then I'm going to do it for the circles. Let's do, I'm selecting one circle, select same fill color. You see? And I also want to do it for the name of the countries, of course. can already delete these numbers, I don't need it. As I was mentioning before, I'm going to show the actual population and GDP number there. Let's keep these labels because they're always helpful. Now that I'm here, I can also redraw these reference lines. I'm always pressing Command D. And let's do it here too. So now I'm satisfied with this size and I'm going to drag my shapes on the scatter plot. Let's move our shapes a little bit closer to the artboard so that it's easier. And let's start from Australia. I drag it here. You see, I want it to be perfectly centered, and I'm going to do the process for all the countries. Again, I'm doing it with 20 countries, but if you feel more comfortable with 10, it's already a good number. If you want to try with 30 or 50, these are also numbers that I often use. Feel free to do it, of course. Okay, great. You see that our visualization is taking shape. So I think that something that I'm going to do is to increase the size of the shapes a little bit, and to do it quickly, I'm going to select them and I'm going to object, transform each. And this is very helpful because it allows you to change the size of each one of the elements, you see. Just make sure that the horizontal and vertical scales are always the same. And you know, I can do it now because now I can see them plotted on the actual graph, and so I can see that there are some small improvements that I can do. And then if they are moved a little bit, I can just adjust them. Okay, so now I want to work on the typography, on the text. I want to change the font and also, of course, to change the alignments because now it's not readable. And for the typography, I'm going to download fonts from Google Fonts. But first, let's save this file as a new version. I like to keep all the different stages, both because it's useful, it's helpful in case I have to come back, as I was mentioning before, to a previous stage, but also because it's nice to see the evolution of your project. Okay, this is Google Fonts. I use it pretty often. It's great because there are tons of free fonts, very well designed, and you can filter them by categories, by font properties, and you can also test them here. And I really love serif fonts, so I want to filter them by serif fonts. Let's see the options that we have. And I'm selecting these Amiri fonts. Also, I always want to check how many styles we have. It's important for me that the font has at least a bold version, an italic one, the regular one, of course, because we are going to use different styles to show different hierarchies and to help the readers in better looking at the insights without the visualization. So it's good to have a font with a certain number of styles. Amiri works for me, so I'm going to download it and I'm going to use it for my visualization. Now back to the visualization. Let's work on the typography. For me, it's easier to have all the text in a new layer, so I'm going to select them and creating a new layer for them. Let's start changing the alignment. There are a few rules that I have decided for my text. First of all, I want to change the typography. Amiri, and let's use the bold because the country is one of the main information, of course, that we are going to write. And then let's also increase the size slightly, okay? And I want to use a set of rules to correctly align all my text, all the name of the countries. With Command K, you can go to Preferences. I want to change my keyboard increment for PT. So I want the name of the country to be 4 PT from the center of the circle. This is my rule. This is the rule that I'm going to use. Now I can also refine some alignments if I have to. And I always want to keep the same rules for each one of the elements I'm working on and to be careful with them, because it's a good way to have a very ordered and organized visualization. So I like to work on organic shapes, as you have seen, but I also like everything to be very well organized and ordered. Let's also move them for PT. Okay, let's see the overall picture. I also want to move them a little bit up so that they are not overlapping with the grid lines. And I also want to work on the cases in which I can pay attention to the exceptions. You see, just to check if there are any overlappings, any things that I should work on. Okay, and now I want to work on the labels for my axis. So as I was mentioning, I want to write the actual numbers because I'm not visualizing the actual GDP and population numbers for each country and just ordering them according to these numbers, but I want to show this number. So let's come back to our dataset. And also let's come back to this tab for row graphs because I just need this information. I want to order my countries. Let's start from the GDP in descending order and selecting the numbers. I also want to simplify those numbers. You see here you can decrease decimal places. Okay, and click 2 times. I copy them. I paste them here. And then you see now it's a single block of text. But what is helpful in this case is to go to Object, Flatten Transparency. Okay, and now you see that these are single blocks of text and it's easier for me to use them. I'm going to ungroup them. Let's align them. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. This is going to be my first country. This my last one. And I'm going to align them again. Distribute objects, vertical, distribute center, so that I didn't have to do it manually. Here we are. And let's do the same thing for population. Let's go back here to our table. This time I want to sort the countries according to population in ascending order. Okay. I'm going to select the data. I want again to simplify those numbers. And remember that this is in thousands, this number. So we are going then to clarify this aspect on our graphic so that it's clear. Copy, Command C, Command D, and I'm going to do something very similar. So I'm going to Object, Flatten Transparency. I'm going to ungroup them. I want to rotate them. Let's align them. Okay, let's move this label. So I'm doing the same thing as before. I want to distribute them horizontally. And I'm going to Object, Transform, Transform Each. And this time I want the scale to be the same, but I want my angle to change. You see? Now they are readable. I'm going to align them to the center, and I want to repeat the same thing that I did before. This has to be aligned to the first country, this to the last one, and now let's realign them. Okay. Also here. Okay, now we have quickly done this part. Now that we are here, let's also change the axis labels. We can use this. I want to copy the title of our column here. And also here. And I want to clearly explain how these countries have been organized. So here I'm going to write countries ordered by GDP. Okay, and now that I'm here, I also want to refine the axis labels. Let's go back to our source because I want to check the GDP data. You see, okay, I wanted to check the data. This is an additional information that I want to add on the GDP. I want everything to be clearly explained and precise. Okay, let's copy this information from here to here. also the population one. And now we are start writing a piece of our legend. We are going to work on a legend in detail later, but let's start writing how these countries are organized clearly using the information that we have here. So here we have countries ordered by GDP. (2019), okay. And here we have the countries ordered by population. So that everything is super clearly explained. Then we are going to refine how these axes look later, but I wanted to already know this information down. And you know something that I also want to do now that we are here? Let's also be super clear on what these numbers represent. So here we have the population, and here we have the value on the GDP. Okay, this is already a part of my legend. I also don't need these axes anymore, so I'm going to delete them. Now it's cleaner. Great, now there are still some numbers that I want to show. I want to show our main information, the per capita emissions data for the first and the last year that we are going to show. So let's select our first year. We already have selected the last year here. I want to organize the countries by year and then by country. Okay, great. And I want to copy and paste my values for all of my countries. Let's start from the first one. I want to simplify those numbers. Again, let's do it directly from here. I want to keep one number after the dots. Okay. I want these numbers to be irregular. And I want to align them. And I want them always to have the same distance from the text. And I want to repeat the same operation for all of my countries.
Now we have all the main elements ready. In the next lesson, we are going to work on all those key elements that can create the bridge between our work and the readers, the legend, the explanatory text, and we are also focusing on the role of feedbacks. In this lesson, we are going to work on all those elements that can help us in creating a bridge between our work and the readers. I mentioned as designing visualizations is an act similar to the writing one for me. I'm writing with visual alphabets, and in some cases also experimenting with new visual letters. And for this reason, it's particularly important to provide the readers with all the tools to use such alphabets, and this is why designing a clear legend is essential for me. And it's very important to properly combine visual elements and also words. Another misconception on this field is thinking that a good infographic doesn't need words to be properly understood. I think this is a wrong approach. Nobody is born data literate. At school, we are taught how to read and to write, but we are not taught how to read graphics, for instance. So I can't take for granted that a reader knows how to read even the simplest infographics. In my case, is even more important because I'm working on complex visualizations with multiple levels of information. So what I like to do is taking an example of one of my shapes and clearly explaining every visual element and what that visual element represents. Let's do it together.
So now it's time to explain each single element, and I want to start from the curved shapes. We are going to work here on the legend layer. I want to copy one of my shapes. Also, let's change its color. And what I want to do is to clearly write with very simple sentences what these elements represent. So in this case, let's start writing the first rule. The curved lines represent the per capita CO2 emissions from 2000 to 2019. And you see, I want to use very simple and clear sentences. This is the main rule. Then, let's go a little bit more into the details. We know that each line represents 1 year, and we are going to write this rule. I I also want to add these textual elements. I want to clarify that this is a country. Here I want to put fake data, and I want to show what these numbers represent. I'm going to create 2 arrows. One for this number and another one for this number. And I want to clarify that these numbers are the per capita emissions in 2000. And here in 2019. Then I'm going to refine the spaces, but now I want to write down my rules. Then let's show more in detail what this sentence means. Each line represents 1 year. I just want to write the main years, the one that we had previously highlighted. I want to do it in italic. Then the next rule that I want to explain is the length of the lines. What does the length of the line represent? And I want to write here that the line length represents the CO2 emissions per capita in tons. And then I want to explain how to read the correct number. You remember that we kept these shapes? This is why keeping them is a good idea, because I want to use this reference grid. Let's use, for instance, United States as reference. Remember that we've also resized the shapes, so I want to make sure that I have the correct reference. So I want the grid to be super precise. Another good idea is every time that you resize things, just note that down, so that you, when have to recreate the legend, you know how to resize everything and all the edits you've done. So I'm gonna use this grid as reference. Let's recolor the shape. I'm not going to use all of it, but just a part of it. I want to show a few values. You see, like 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. I'm going to show these values here. So at first, let's remove this piece, we don't need it. Let's start resizing here the 5 values. I want to show different steps, 5, 10, 15, and so on, with 3 curves for each, so that it's a little bit easier for the reader to understand them. I've resized 3 curves to get to the 5 number. Now let's do the same for 10, 15. You see, I'm explaining a few of these values because I want to show some length, to show some examples. Then let's go to 20. And let's also do 25. Okay, it's enough for me as example, so I can remove the other lines. And then I want to create a clearer grid, of course, because this one is not as clear. I want to create my own grid using this graphic as reference. So I'm going to redraw these circles. 1, Command F1, 15, 20. Let's find this one. Okay, let's keep this one even if we don't actually need it anymore. You see that this grid is already starting becoming clearer. And now I want to cut the parts that I don't need here. I want my grid to start from this curve. See, I'm cutting all these parts. And I want to be able to put my values here, as I did for the years. So for instance, here I'm going to write 5. You see, because this was the 5 value. Let's repeat it with 10. I want this to arrive to this point. 15. So you see, I'm using some sample values and explaining them to give the readers a visual guide, a visual tool. I forgot one circle, but I'm going to add it now. This is 20, and now the last one, 25. And then we also note down the 2029 years. So this is another way to help the readers in reading these shapes, in looking at these numbers. Okay, you see that I've now explained this other rule. And now there is this other visual element that has to be explained. So here what happens. I'm going to take it as an example again. Also in this case, at first, let's explain the main rule. What does the circle represent? The circle represents the total annual CO2 emissions in 2019. And then let's go a little bit more into details. The circle's area represents the emissions in tons, remember? Always, if you have doubts, come back to the source, to your spreadsheet, to the original source to check the units of measure. Remember that this is always essential, very, very important. Now, in this case, I don't want to use a grid, but I want to write the actual number of the annual CO2 emissions, so I'm going to write it later. So I'm already preparing an example here. Let's put a random number. So I won't show, as I did in this case, a grid to explain how to read all the sizes, because I'm simply actually writing the numbers, as I did for the 2019 here for the per capita emissions. And so I'm going to do the same thing that I did here. I'm going to write that this number represents the annual CO2 emissions. Now that I've created the main elements of my legend, I want to organize them a little bit. Being this one, and this one, my main rules, I want them to be in bold. These are showing a little bit more in detail how to read the shapes, so I want to have the same hierarchy. And then these elements are explaining even more in detail how to read the numbers. And I want them to be in italic. So you see, I want to define also visual rules for my legend. It's again a way to guide the readers a little bit more and to help them. Let's increase this one a little bit more. Now I want to write a text that clearly explains how I visualize the data, and remember also the selections that I made. It's very important. This is going to be the title of my visualization. CO2 emissions per country. And now I'm going to write my text. Remember, it's important again to combine words and visual elements to explain our project. Don't be afraid to use text. It's good to help the readers in understanding what we are working on. But let's use very, again, short, simple and clear sentences. First of all, what is the visualization showing? The visualization shows data on CO2 emissions per capita and total CO2 emissions for 20 countries. Let's create a paragraph. Then, what are these countries? And so I'm going to explain how I did selected them. The selected countries are the top 20s for emissions per capita in 2019. But let's also explain our other criteria of selection among the states with a population of more than 5 million people. I want to explain a little bit more in details the data that I have for each country. You see, I'm explaining that for the per capita data, we have the information from 2000 to 2019. Finally, let's explain how we arrange the countries on the space along our axis. Another very important point is to add the source of our project, the sources in our case. Let's use this italic for the sources. It's very important to declare the sources so that the readers can check them if they want to. Okay, now I want to organize these elements and align them a little bit better. I also like to have separators in my legends so that the legend is divided into clear sections. And now that I'm here, let's also start changing the color of the circles. Select same fill color. I'm going to refine it later, but I want to use kind of a neutral color, a lighter version of the one that we are using for the curved shapes. Let's save it as a version, super important. Back to our text, I see that there are a few typos. I'm going to adjust them and then I'm going to check everything later just to see that there are no any more typos. And at this point, my suggestion is to take some time to do something else, take a pause or work on another project, and then come back to your visualization with a fresh lens. This is helpful because it can allow you to exit from the intense workflow bubble we immersed into and then come back to our project with a new, fresh lens and a new perspective. So the point of view that we want to explore is always the user's one. In this case, I've just taken a break, and after the break, I asked myself, is there anything else I can do to improve the visualization and help the readers in using it? For instance, I'd like to use some visual variables to show some insights and to provide some additional information. The first insight that I want to show is whether the per capita emissions for each country are increased or decreased from 2000 to 2019. I'm curious into showing this element, this information, and I want to use the color for that. So what I'm going to do is to check country by country this information, so whether the emissions are decreased or increased, and I'm going to select the ones where the emissions have increased. Let's block all the levels we are not interested into so that we are going easily selecting them. Okay, now that I've selected them, I'm going to change the color. For now, this is the color that I'm going to use, but it's just for me. I'm going to refine the colors later. And so this is the first time that I'm using the color as variable in my visualization. Color is a very strong visual variable, and my overall rule is to use it with care. I tend not to use too many colors, for instance, because then the visualization can become not easily readable. And in the additional resources section, you will find some interesting and very helpful articles on the usage of colors in data visualization. So now that I've shown this first insight, and let me start using another color for the ones with decreasing emissions, just to start better showing the differences. Okay, we are going to refine them later anyway. And then there is a second insight that I'm interested into showing. The here within each country with the highest value of the per capita emissions. It can also help us in understanding the trends a little bit more, for instance. So in order to obtain this information, I want to come back to the For Illustrator tab, and I want to select all of my countries one by one. Let's start from Australia, and order them according to the per capita emissions in descending order. And you see, for instance, for Australia is 2004. And now that I know this data, I come back to my visualizations, I create a new layer for it, and I want to create a symbol that highlights that here. I'm going to use a circle, and I'm going to put it here. Let's use the same color that we have here. And I'm going to repeat this operation for all of my countries. I splitted my screen into parts again so that it's easier for me to go back from the table to the visualization. So let's select the next country. I'm reordering in descending order the data on the per capita CO2 emissions, and we see that in Austria is 2005. So let's come back to our visualization and let's put our dot here. Change the country again, Belgium. Let's do it for Canada. I also want to use the same color as the shape here, so I'm going to change it. And you see, these are details, additional layers of information that can allow you to show insights and also more detailed stories within our dataset. For instance, it's very different if the year with the highest emissions was 20 years ago or 2 years ago. So I think it's an interesting data to show. Okay, and I'm going to repeat the operation for all of my countries. I've added all of my dots and I also rechecked the data, for instance discovering that I had put the wrong year in Australia. It can happen, and this is why it's a good idea to do some checks to control if everything has been done well, and also to check that there are no errors or mistakes. So now I want to add this additional information to our legend. And we are always talking about the curved line, so it's going to be here in this macro section of our legend. I'm taking one example, one shape as example, as I did before. This is a new rule, so I want to create a new small paragraph. Let's use an arrow again. And again, I want to write a clear, short sentence to explain this part. What does this dot do? Okay, the dot highlights the year with the highest data per country within the indicated time range. We are going to arrange the space better later in the last phase. And finally, let's explain the color. Let's also put this in the legend layer. Okay. We keep the red color and then we also use this color so that we have both of them. And again, very simple explanations. You see, I'm simply explaining my rule. Now there are two more things that I'd like to add. Remember that comment that we noted down on Turkmenistan GDP, that we only had this value for 2018? Let's write it here as a note, so that people know that this is an exception of our rule, 2019 GDP data. And finally, I want to copy and paste my last number, the annual CO2 emissions. Remember this number. And I want this number to have a different color, so that we can distinguish from the other ones. Let's see. And I want it to be under the years. So let's go back to our data. Let's split the screen again. We can come back to this tab. Let's reselect all our countries. This time we are just interested in seeing 2019 data. I can order them. And let's copy this number, the annual CO2 emissions, one by one. Let's put it here in text. Our note. These are very complex numbers, so I want to put the comma each 3 numbers so that it's easier to be read. Austria. Also, I want to be careful that the distance between the different texts is always the same, so that everything looks organized and clean. An alternative, if you don't want to write those numbers as I am doing, is to create another legend here in which you can take two values, 2, 3, 4 values, and to explain this represents this quantity of emissions, these other quantities, and so on. In my case, I wanted to show the number, but feel free, if you prefer, to also create a legend with different sample sizes for this part. Okay, and I'm going to repeat this for all my countries.
Now that we have designed all those visual elements that can help the readers in reading our piece, it's very important to test them. And my parents, for instance, are my favorite testers because they are not data visualization experts and therefore they represent the majority of my potential readers. I always send them work in progress and also the legend and then the explanatory text because it's very important for me to understand if the guides I'm creating are understandable for an external reader. And in general, I think that taking some moments for detaching from my works while they are still in progress, to show them to someone else, is a very good way not to be trapped in myself. For instance, I noticed that when I come back to my works after having sent them to my parents or friends, I often have new intuitions on how to improve them even before reading their comments. So I suggest you to show your projects to someone else, to test its clearness, and to listen to their feedback. They can be extremely precious. In the next lesson, we are going to work on all those final touches that can help us in having a project that is both communicatively and also visually valid. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how we can visually refine our projects and work on the last details. This is a phase that I particularly love. I used to say that I usually work at a 1000% zoom and at a 50% one at the same time, keeping always in mind the 100% zoom, of course. This means that I love both to look at the overall picture, but also to look in detail and with care on all those visual refinements that I can work on. And apart from printing text in the correct size, of course, I usually find very helpful to step in away from my works in progress. And I don't know exactly why, but I also need to detach from the device I'm working with. So at a certain point, I always look at my visualizations in progress from my smartphone. And having a new point of view from which to look at the visualization helps me in finding elements in the overall composition that are not working and that I should work on. Let's do this together with our project.
Okay, now let's look at our visualization with a 50% zoom. To have an idea of the overall compositions, what are the elements we can work on? First of all, looking at it from this other zoom, I think that I'd like to increase the font size, the country's name of 1 point, because I'd like them to be more visible. So this is the first thing that I'm going to do. Let's block all the things that I don't need. You see, I want them to pop up a little bit more. 1 point. Now I like the overall composition, but I think that I would like to increase the circle size a little bit more, because here there are some points in which they are not so visible, so I want to increase their size a little bit more. I'm doing it by select same fill color, select this object, transform each, slightly smaller. Okay, and I also want to give them a multiply effect so that I can see the overlappings. It works for me. Then I want to adjust an overlapping here. You see the Turkmenistan shape, and there is also a shape that I should have here. Let's move down these lines a little bit and selecting those lines, and let's move them too. Okay, and I also want these grid elements to be less thick. Okay, better. This has to be adjusted. so that the distance is always the same. Let's also use an arrow here, it's clearer, the same that we used here. Both for the population and for the GDP. For the GDP I want to use something more like this. Let's come back to a 50% zoom. Okay, still want to move this up a little bit. And now the overall composition works for me. And now I want to look at the visualization details. I've looked at some of them before, but in general I want to be super sure of the visual elements. And also I think that the care that emerges from this focus can be understood by the readers more or less consciously and can have a role in their engagement. So first of all, I want to change the colors of my shapes. I want to slightly refine them. Always with the same tool, it's a very helpful one. Now I want to look at the visualization's details, the colors, the textures, the look and feel. I think that the care that emerges from this focus can be understood by the readers more or less consciously and can have a role in their engagement too. So first of all, I want to change the colors. Let me just select my per capita shapes and also the same shape in the legend. This color, I want to slightly change it. It also has to be the same as in the legend. So let's do this. Okay, and I also want to slightly change this one. Then I'd like to increase the thickness of these lines, you know, the ones for 2025 and so on. So I go to select, same, stroke weight, and let's try. You can experiment, you can see what it works for you. Yes, I like this. I also want to increase this one. Select same, stroke weight. Let's try with this. Okay. And I want to add a very small effect that it can just be perceived as a very high zoom. But again, I think that these small details can have a role on the final look and feel of the project. I want these shapes to have a multiplier effect, so that you can see that when there are overlappings, there is this nice shade. Okay, and now I want to change the circle's color. Select same, fill color. And sometimes I like to use a very light gradient to give more depth to the visualization. Let's see. Let's remove this, we don't need it. Let's change this color. It's fine, we are going to refine it directly from using this tool. Of course, I don't want the gradient to be this strong, but I can refine these two colors here. Now I want this to stay as it is, and I want this to be like a similar version, maybe more on pink. You can try different solutions, and then I can also add maybe some grain to it. Let's do the contrary. I want to find a color I'm satisfied with. This is a part that I enjoy doing, so I like to take some time to work on the details with a very deep focus on them and with this care. Maybe these are details that I will be the only person to notice, but these are important to me. One last thing, I have to change this color. Okay. I also want to increase the title size. It's important that the title is bigger. Let's also increase this. So here we are. I've refined the colors a little bit more. I've also added a very light grain effect to my gradients. It's an effect I like to add sometimes. And then I'm ready to export the file. So I usually send to the clients both the Illustrator or EPS file and the PDF. I had already saved this as Illustrator, so let's save it as EPS too. Sometimes the clients ask me for the file in this format. Okay. And let's also save it as PDF. And then I also export my visualization as PNG or JPEG, and then I use some details from it to be shared on social media after the publication of the project, of course. So I'm going to export it as an image. I choose the maximum resolution possible, and we're finished.
And now we finally have our project. I usually send both the PDF and the Illustrator file to the clients, but then I also export the visualization as PNG or JPEG, and then I use some details from it to be shared on social media. I use social media a lot to share my projects. I use Twitter and Instagram, for instance. And even if my projects are not meant to be visualized on Instagram, I think that sharing details, I also share details of the legend, is a good way to share my work, my approach to data visualization, and also to create a community of people who are curious about what I am doing, and also clients. We finally reached the end of the course, but don't leave me yet. In the next video, we are going to recap everything that we learned step by step. We have now reached the end of the course and you are ready to take on to the final project. As you have seen, data visualization is a very broad field that allows us to unveil many layers of information about urgent and relevant topics. It allows us to create visual alphabets to illustrate reality and to present the data in a visually striking way, easy to understand by our readers. Also, we can use data visualization in many platforms, from newspapers, magazines, articles, or books. Any topic can be analyzed in terms of data and rendered in an illustration. Always remember that you will have a reader that needs to understand our proposal. If you already have a topic in mind, you know where to start. Maybe you even have someone to collaborate with, but if you don't, explore the many websites I gave you. Choose something you are interested in and select at least 2 datasets to be able to make comparisons. Download the data in CSV format and import them in Google Sheet or a similar software you'd like to use. There, you can clean and organize your data so your graphs will account all the layers of information you want to present. Before exploring how the graph will look like, sketch ideas on paper. Ask yourself, what is the best way to present this data? There is no compromise here. Just try things out, and when you have it, look for visual inspiration. This is the cool part, where information and visual come together. After that, I recommend you to use raw graphs to create the skeleton of your design. This will help you to land your idea and identify points of improvement. Move on to Illustrator to create your design. I recommend to use a minimum of 10 items. I use 20 to enrich the paper. Make sure to create a legend to help the reader understand the visual alphabets that you have proposed, and ask for feedback to check it works. Lastly, export your piece and post it on the forum. I will be there as much as I can. I cannot wait to see your creations and learn from you. Thank you for taking this course. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. Bye!